The chat is closed, but you can submit questions using the Q&A feature available to you at any time. So whenever you feel moved to ask a question, please feel free to do so, and I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation. Closed captioning is available to you on your toolbar as well. And a reminder of the Q&A, I will try to read as broad a sample of questions as I can, but as you may expect, we might not be able to get to all of them. Do thank you for submitting them, however. And of course, I'd like to extend a thank you to our partner bookstores this evening. So obviously I'm here representing Literati Bookstore, but you may have come through some of our wonderful partner bookstores this evening. Prairie Lights, whose t-shirt I'm proudly wearing this evening as a former Iowa City resident, the King's English Bookshop, and Tattered Cover. And one of the lights of these often dark times has been the ability for our stores to forge strong connections. There's a tremendous network of incredible, hardworking independent bookstores across this country. I'm so grateful to highlight just a few of them and to join them in presenting this event to you this evening. And finally, on behalf of Literati, thank you for your support. You make these events in a very difficult time for our bookstores possible, and they in turn make our work sustainable. So my fellow hardworking booksellers at Literati, at Prairie Lights, at King's English, and Tattered Cover, thank you. And we're so grateful to be able to share this amazing night, not only with the community that has sustained our stores, but new communities far beyond our storefronts. So without further ado, let me introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Amor Towles is the author of the New York Times bestsellers Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow. The two novels have collectively sold more than 4 million copies and have been translated into more than 30 languages. Towles lives in Manhattan with his wife and 2 children, and he's joined this evening by Erik Larson, the author of 6 national bestsellers, The Splendid and the Vile, Deadwake, In the Garden of Beasts, Thunderstruck, The Devil in the White City, and Isaac's Storm, which have collectively sold more than 10 million copies. His books have been published in nearly 20 countries as well. Please join me in welcoming Amor Towles and Erik Larson into your living rooms.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Amor, hello.
Erik, good to see you. Thanks, John.
Yep. So first of all, congratulations on the book. I think it's fabulous. I really do.
Thank you very much.
Clearly others agree, since it seems to be going gangbusters. So without preamble, let's talk about it. So one thing, forgive me for asking a question you've probably been asked already this fall a zillion times, but I am always very interested in the answer. The moment of conception for a book. And I'm not talking about, when you've talked to your agent, you've got the contract in hand and so forth. I'm talking about the moment of conception. I know enough about you to know that you are almost never without your notebook, right?
Right.
So now, if I were to go backward in some sort of forensic way through all of your notebooks, where will I come to the very first reference to what has become the Lincoln Highway? What's the point of conception?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, Erik, thank you very much for joining me tonight in this conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your life to do it. And I want to thank the 4 stores who are supporting this event tonight. I have spoken personally in 3 of the 4 of them. My guess is Erik has spoken in at least 3 of the 4 of them. And it's a bittersweet thing because he and I are both used to being there in person with our readers. And we don't get to do that as easily this year, but on the other hand, we get to allow some people to come into the conversation that would not have been able to attend. And so,
absolutely. So, Amor, are you dodging the question?
No. Now let's get to the question. So the answer is for me, I think it's helpful to set it up that I've been writing fiction since I was a kid. It's really all I ever really wanted to do, and over the course of my life, ideas for books or stories usually present themselves as in a flash, as a notion, in a sentence or two, sort of almost as you describe it. So a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. Literally, that's sort of the notion I had walking into a hotel that within a matter of hours had expanded to sort of the premise for A Gentleman in Moscow. Sometimes I know exactly where I was when I had the idea for the story. In the case of the Lincoln Highway, it was a very simple notion. I had it more than a decade ago, but I don't remember where I was. But the notion that struck me was of a young, honorable young man who has, through an accident in essence, ended up having to do time in a juvenile facility. And he's being driven home by the warden. And the warden is saying, you're a good person. You've paid your debt to society. You should be prepared to start your life fresh. And the hero, Emmett Watson, says that's exactly my intention. And when the warden drives away, it turns out that two young friends from the juvenile facility have hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. And they have a very different sort of vision for how Emmett should live his near-term future. And everything starts to go awry. And the notion was just the kid being driven home by the warden and the two kids hiding in the trunk of the car and setting things in motion in the wrong direction. So
that was 10 years ago.
Yes.
In the interim, you did Gentlemen in Moscow.
Yes.
So how does that work for you? What made you? I'm very interested in this kind of inside pool. So forgive me, but what made you do the Gentlemen in Moscow first before this?
Well, because that story was already in design and in development from years before the Lincoln Highway.
Okay.
And so what you have to picture, I mean, to your point, is that when I have a notion.
Are we talking about Zeno's paradox here?
A little bit. So when I have a notion that particularly strikes me and grabs my attention, usually it presents itself with certain characteristics in the first 15 minutes. So in the case of the Lincoln Highway, right away, I knew it was going to be a kid returning to a farm in the Midwest, that the farm would be in bankruptcy, that his father would have died, that he has a little brother, that it would take place in the mid-50s, and that the whole story would last 10 days. All that I knew within minutes. When I get really intrigued with the story, then I start spending time over the course of years imagining every aspect of the story in as much detail as possible. The various events, the settings, the characters and their backgrounds, some of the thematic focus of the story. I start to do that. And then, yes, as you're talking about, I start to do that, which is
Yep.
by hand. I start to accumulate notebooks. But now I have notebooks on multiple ideas that are in development at the same time.
Do you have individual notebooks devoted to each idea,
Yes.
or do you collect numerous ideas until one rises to the top?
When I think I have notebooks that are kind of a catch-all, but when something really gets interesting to me, yes, it gets upgraded to its own series of notebooks. And so in the case of the Lincoln Highway, I filled maybe 5 notebooks by hand over the multi-year time period in which I was designing the book. And the first of those is dated 2014, first notebook. And the last notebook was completed as I was finishing, the book itself, I guess.
Interesting.
So then I take that, and that becomes an outline, a very detailed outline. And I do all of that before I start writing chapter 1. So it is this long process. But now I go back to your question. When I finish a work like A Gentleman in Moscow, I'm looking out at the various ideas I have, which are in various stages of development, sort of in terms of my imagination, in terms of notebooks. And very often I'll sort of say, oh, that's the one I'm going to do. Now, it shouldn't come as a big surprise to any of you, right? Is that having just spent 4 years writing a book about a guy who's trapped in a hotel, and it's a 30-year story, the pile I ended up deciding to pick up and work on was about 18-year-old kids on a 10-year journey, because you're almost, as a writer, looking for a relief from the constraints that I've been living in for a couple of years. I want you as the reader to get something fresh.
Well, and of course you meant 10 day. I mean, it was a 10
day. Did I say 10 years?
10 day journey. So then that you're touching on something very interesting there in terms of process. So you've got all these notebooks. How do you then evaluate? Certainly these others were keening in their way for your attention, and maybe they still are. Maybe the next project you're going to do is already sitting in one of those notebooks, probably is. Yes. And if so, I hate your guts, because I never know what I'm going to do in the next thing. But how do you evaluate something that you think you're actually going to work on? I mean, do you weigh it and say, boy, is this the right book now to follow up on Gentlemen in Moscow? Should I hold off on this for another decade? I mean, how do you evaluate what to do when?
I definitely don't ask myself how the market would receive it. That's not of interest to me. It is sort of an instinct about doing something different. or it doesn't even have to be an instinct. It's pretty clear. And in the case of the Lincoln Highway, for instance, and let me elaborate what I mean by doing something different and why I want to do something different.
Right.
Yes, because variety's the spice of life, but more importantly is when I take a story like A Gentleman in Moscow and I shift to a story like the Lincoln Highway, I have to retool every aspect of my craft. So, and this may be a way in which to some degree, I say our two art forms differ, but when I shift from telling a 30-year story about an aristocrat in Russia in a hotel to a 10-day story of 18-year-old boys in the 1950s in America, of course, the setting's changing. The personalities are changing. But more importantly, the structure of the story has to change. The tone of the story, those vocabulary of the characters, the semantics that are suitable to the story, the poetics that are suitable to the story, all of that, the style of the dialogue, the use of imagery, all of that, and the way the similes are applied, all of that has to change when I go from one story to the other. And that's what I find interesting, right? Which is, so I want to, taking the big shifting gears really forces me or allows me to revisit all the various elements of craft in the novel and almost try to reinvent them to the new purpose at hand. And in the case of Lincoln Highway, there's no question about it. The biggest factor there, the biggest challenge, or one of the two, was the shift from 30 years to 10 days. Because in a 30-year story like The Gentleman in Moscow, I have the opportunity, as the writer, you have the opportunity as a reader to experience evolution. And that's really, The Gentleman in Moscow is very much about evolution, in that you have this individual who is going through new phases of discovering purpose in his life over that 30 years. You have a flirtation that ends up in a full season, a seasoned romance. You have, in essence, a babysitting job that evolves into the parenting of a young, adult woman. You have a job that becomes a series of friendships, of deep friendships, and you have the country evolving at the same time over this 30-year period. So all that is a part of the pleasure of writing A Gentleman in Moscow. It's a part of the pleasure of reading it. In the case of Lincoln Highway, since it is a 10-day story, I don't have the luxury of spooling that out, of tracking those kinds of changes. So instead, because you want the book to encompass, so in essence, a vision of the characters in a grander scale than just the 10 days. The challenge is, how do I bring glimpses of the past into the narrative? How do I get glimpses of the future into this 10-day aperture? And that's, as I say, that ends up being one of the biggest challenges of that narrative shifts. And that's the attraction to me. It's not simply the variety, it's having the new task, which requires new tools.
Right, and that certainly must keep you fresh and keep you from, I mean, if you're not experimenting with new techniques and tactics and so forth, I mean, imagine it could become kind of drudgery. But I do have I am curious. You say that you never do something for the market, but I do wonder, after Gentleman in Moscow, which again, as I've told you before, I think is absolutely a magical novel and a huge success. Do you not feel any pressure afterwards on the next book to equal that, or do you just put that out of your mind?
I really don't think about it very much, and I think that's
you said very much.
I think about it, I'm 57. We're not that different in age. I have two teenagers, and so I had a 20-year career in the investment, arena before I wrote, I wrote Rules of Civility while still being an investment professional, and retired when that book came out. But so my point being that my life is very full with, I've had great experiences and I have a full demanding life with teenagers, et cetera. So, and I think that provides me a certain maturity around just saying, okay, I'm going to do the next thing, and however the next thing lands. I was lucky to have the last thing land so well, and I really thought that the Lincoln Highway, frankly, would not do as anywhere near as well as A Gentleman in Moscow, and I warned my publishing house and my editor that was the case. Not to give anything away, but there's some darker aspects to the story. The fact that it was about these 18-year-old boys, I just thought it was not going to grab the interest of the readers who loved A Gentleman in Moscow. And
Yeah, but apparently you're wrong.
well, it turned out I was wrong enough. I was wrong enough to be in a happy circumstance. But so I mean, but that's, genuine. And so maybe I was preparing myself just for potential disappointment. But for me, it is about I want to push back those concerns about the marketplace so that I can tell the story in the way it should be told, with the elements that it deserves, with the tone it deserves, with the outcomes and for the characters that it deserves. And I worry that if you start sort of imagining how it would be received, or its role in or how it would land in the marketplace, that you would start to interfere with the integrity of the imaginative process.
Right.
And that would ultimately probably undermine the success of the book, ironically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, was there ever a time, though, as you were writing the Lincoln Highway, that your own Odysseus-like courage faltered, that you thought to yourself? So tell me about one of those moments.
Yes. Of course, it's multiple times. And it takes me, a couple of years a couple of years designing a book. It takes me more than a year to write the first draft, and then more time to revise. But the big version of what you're describing, without question, and had very big ramifications, is that, as I say, I outline everything, so I know everything's going to happen, and then I know the chapters, by chapter, what's going to happen. Is I got the original plan for the Lincoln Highway was that the 10 days would be described from the perspective of two main characters: Emmett Watson, the hero from the farm in the Midwest, and his friend Duchess from New York, sort of a kid from a rougher, grittier background, and who was one of the kids hiding in the trunk of the car, who's escaped from the facility. And the story over the 10 days would go back and forth. You'd hear a day from Emmett's perspective, the same day from Duchess's, and then the second day and the third day, you'd do the same thing. It would move forward. And I had written, I would say 30-40% of the book in that style. And I got to about a third of the way through the book, and I did have a big moment of loss of confidence. And I was feeling like it wasn't working exactly right. And what I should add this, that the way the book is titled, it was day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6. That's what it said in the outline. That's what it said in the manuscript as I was writing. And I get to this point, and I was frustrated with where it was going and what the purpose of. I thought I was spreading out too much. I felt that I was losing a sense of internal urgency. I felt that there were passages that didn't matter. I felt that their characters were loose. I felt there was a general loss of faith, as you say. And when that happens to me, I basically say, walk away, take a couple of days, let it dwell on it, go back to the beginning in my head and sort of think it through. And as I was doing this, one of the things that happened from it, the first thing was, as I said, this is not a book that is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. This is a book that is really 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's what it is. And all that means, a countdown. And you think about a countdown. One of the great things about it is we use it to measure the end of a heavyweight boxing match. It's the end for the loser, and we use it to launch rocket ships. We use it to launch the new year, right? And so to some degree, the countdown is the end of last year, and to some degree, it's the beginning of next year. It's the ending and a beginning. And as soon as I had this thought, I immediately went back and I literally just changed the titles from day 1 to 10, from day 2 to 9. I didn't change the order of events, sequence events, or the outline in a big way. But what I did do is go back to the beginning and start reading through it and revising with this sense of the countdown in play. Because I did know that the story would be one where you're moving towards fateful moments, where you are, in a sense, running out of time, where potentialities are moving towards sort of finite, irreversible events. And so that allowed me to kind of rethink how each chapter sounded, what the characters were saying. Yeah. And that was a big thing. Now, the other thing that happened at around the same time is I realized this book shouldn't be just from the perspective of the two characters. I knew the character Willie very well. I knew Sally well. I knew Ulysses well. I knew their voices. I knew their personalities, but we weren't really hearing from them as they were characters, but not, you didn't have chapters from their perspectives. And so as I was rebuilding, I began adding chapters from the perspectives of different characters. And I went from it being perspective story to an 8 perspective story. You hear from 8 different people over the course of the book. And these two things kind of, which are really radical changes from what my original vision was in many ways, help bail me out of that deep moment of doubt.
I see. Okay, interesting. And for readers who have not yet read the book, you really literally begin with, section, what do you call it? Section or chapter or part or?
Yeah, I guess section, yeah.
Section 10.
Yeah.
And then counts down 9 to 1. So so I found that fascinating. Now let's talk a little bit though about these characters. Very compelling characters, and they're very can I use the word fresh? And that is to say, I've just not come across characters like Wooly or Duchess, and I'd love to talk at some length about Duchess and how you layered him in, but there's too much of a spoiler alert there, so I'm going to avoid that completely. But what I'm curious about is, are these characters based in any way on people you've known?
They aren't, and they never have been in my work. So Nobody in Rules of Civility is based on someone. The Gentleman in Moscow is not based on anyone. These characters are inventions. And having written fiction since I was a kid, I kind of grew up in school's the wrong word for it, but I grew up as a young writer, interested in writing one story after another from different perspectives. That's what I would do. So I would say I write a story, but from the perspective of a banker in England in the turn of the century, and then the next I'd be writing a story of a young African American in the South, and then I write a story about a violin maker in New York from a German immigrant, or I would just keep moving. And that process really as a sort of became my training ground. And it dovetailed with one of my primary interests as a writer, which is that I'm very interested in voice. I'm very interested how a narrative can capture a human perspective, the tone of a person's voice, not simply a tone, but their sentiments and their psychological quirks and their confidence and lack of it, their humor, all this can be captured in the language of a narrative, whether it's third person or first. You can do it in either case. I don't write in an omniscient third person. I have not done that. I've written in third person that's a reflection of someone's internal life, like in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow. So that's kind of where I come from, and in essence, as a writer, and I've developed that way. So inventing people is a central part of writing fiction for me, and hearing that internal mindset is a critical component of that. And that's something that I will tend to very early in the invention process. I'll get a pretty quick sense of what Emmett's like, or what Duchess is like, or what Wooly's like. And I don't mean like the biographical stuff. That's there too, Duchess, but it's kind of more the tone. So I'll use Duchess as an example. I'm not going to give away anything from this, but he's a perfect example. Right at the beginning, I had this notion of, Duchess is going to be raised in Lower Manhattan. His father is a failed Shakespearean who ends up on the vaudeville circuit as vaudeville's dying. And what he's doing is he's giving Shakespearean monologues. That's his act in vaudeville, and sort of a dying vaudeville. And he's a drinker. He's a quasi con man, and he's surrounded by other failing performers and failing vaudeville who are drinkers and quasi con men, but they're all colorful. And I had this notion of Duchess, who, he's not in school. He's following his dad on the road, is that he's heard these, 15 Shakespearean monologues hundreds of times, but he's never seen the plays. So here's a kid with no education, growing up in a tough part of town, as it were, but has this highfalutin language of Shakespeare, which he's inherited, with its metaphors, its sentiments, its sort of high psychology, but he doesn't really have the context of the plays to know necessarily what they mean. Whether Macbeth is a good guy or a bad guy, or whether, Lear is sane or not. He just knows the language. And so I had this sort of idea, that's kind of I began with my sort of sense of Duchess. But then you kind of add to that this kid growing up in that part of the world, part of America, is here's a good example, Emmett. I always had this sort of sense he'd be a very honorable kid from the Midwest. And, you know, for those of us who spend time in the Midwest or have relatives from the Midwest, there is a Midwestern sensibility in America. I think it's true. I think it's true. And it makes sense, right? We have this sort of frontier generation in the 19th century that really kind of built the life of the Midwest, breaking land, tough winters, neighbors that were, you know, miles away, physicians that were 50 miles away. And like one of the things I think about that is that there's a long-standing sort of culture in the Midwest, which is neighborly. You know, if a neighbor comes to you in need, you would respond to that because you may need that neighbor in the future. If you grew up in New York in the early 20th century, you were suspicious of your neighbor because that's what your life depended on that, you know? So those are very different experiences of the way that you grow up. Religion is very different in the Midwest versus in the city. What is right and wrong is very different in the Midwest, where I think it's a cleaner version of right and wrong, whereas in the city, it's a little bit more fluid, in New York City. So I know that these things are going to infuse the personalities of Emmett and Duchess. And then my biggest job is to sort of capture that in the tone of when you're in an Emmett chapter, when you're in a Duchess chapter, what does it sound like? When you take all those psychological elements, how does it translate into language?
So I'm not going to ask you who your favorite character is, but I'm going to ask you which of your characters most engaged you. I'm not avoiding the question by saying it's pretty equal, because they're very different. Very different.
And when I discover the tone and personality of Willie, that's a great satisfaction to me as a writer, because also I can feel that person coming to life in the narrative and claiming more territory and having a bigger impact on events. And I can feel the emotional impact that they'll have on the other characters as I can hear and see that person coming to life in greater shape. And then you know that's very exciting, you know, for me as a writer. And then I hope it translates into excitement for the reader when they encounter that personality and the resonance with the other characters. And each of those is in its own discovery. And like Sally, I think is a great example. I love Sally's chapters. And because
I do too.
Her personality is so strong. I think she's hilarious. And she's very wise in this sort of tough way. And I love the way that comes across. And that makes me, bond to her in a way. But each of the characters, there's a different way in which I feel bonded. For better or worse, I tend to like my characters, even the bad ones, and that was true to Gentleman Moscow, it was true in Rules of Civility. And maybe that's, that helps keep me in the game, as it were, is finding what I like about each of those characters.
Well, and it is the case that I would argue that in Lincoln Highway that you could, if you blindfolded, well, you wouldn't blindfold, but if you just jumped into the text without any marker like the chapter title or anything like that, that you would know which character was speaking.
Yes, and I certainly hope that's the case, and that's a lot of the work goes into ensuring that's the case. Because if you're going to shift to a story where you have eight different perspectives that are going to be shared, if two are alike or sound alike, it's for the reader, it's confusing. It's also like, why are you doing this? It doesn't seem to be additive. It can be distracting. So it is part of the challenge to make sure that each of those voices is distinct, because basically that also becomes tantamount to them being more lifelike. The more distinct their voice, the more they will feel like a living person to the reader, I think.
No, absolutely. So shifting a little bit, all three of your novels thus far, your big published novels, they're of course markedly different, but there is one common thread, and that is that they are set back in history, and not just in history, but in sort of from early to mid 20th century.
Yeah.
Right. Correct. Although Gentleman in Moscow sort of spans a much broader period. These guys in the 50s, Rules of Civility 20s.
38.
38.
But yeah.
So what is it about that broadly speaking, that period that appeals? Or is that just an accident of three different novels?
It's half and half, because I have written short stories that take place in contemporary New York, or in the 90s, the 2000s. I think I will write a novel. I've written stories that take place slightly in the future. I think I will write novels that will get closer and closer to the time period we're in. So it's not as if I have any objection to that. But it is true that the distance of, call it 70 years, for me is very fruitful. And it's very fruitful because 70 years ago means, so 1950, let's say, and this book takes place in 1954, so it's almost exactly 70 years ago. 3 years shy of 70 years ago. 70 years ago means that the vast majority of Americans do not remember that time period vividly, right? Because to live it vividly, you'd have to be 80 and up, let's say. So most Americans would not, some have, but most not. For 1938, it's a much smaller group than that, right? And but the majority of Americans who are older than 10 or 15 or whatever have some sense of that moment of time. And they have that sense because it's been handed down to them, or through pop culture, or through the novels they read, or the movies they've seen, whatever. There's a sense of that period. It's not so far in the distant past that we don't feel like we have some kind of awareness of it, some sense of what it was like. And that combination, that most Americans didn't witness it, but most Americans feel like they know something about it, is very fruitful for me as a novelist, because I give some landmarks that will help the reader position themselves and feel like, okay, yes, I am in 1954, I'm in 38 in New York. Then I can start to play with things. I can start to invent things that feel like they're historic when they're not. I can take an element of history and make it seem like it's a crazy invention when in fact it actually happened. And I can start to get to the point where it's hard for the reader to sort of really pinpoint, is this thing for real or is this thing not? Almost element by element. And I love that.
All right. So you just touched on something very interesting. I was somehow trying to find a way to ask you about this, and you just sort of gave me the ideal entree into that. You've done a couple of very interesting things about adding texture to otherwise, straightforward text. You have a photograph of, well, can I say what it's about? Do you think that's going to?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
So it's a photograph basically of a civil defense test that was actually very effective, and everybody in Manhattan cleared the streets.
Yes.
And it's so interesting that even as I read that, I found myself. I grew up in the '60s. We did the duck and cover, all that stuff. But even as I read that, I thought, oh wait, did that really happen? And then suddenly, boom, there's a photograph of that very thing, and it was brilliantly placed and timed, may I say. So yeah, that actually worked very well.
But can I tell you about that?
What?
Can I tell you something about that? Because I think you'll be entertained by this. And we have talked about this before in the way that I approach things, but I don't pick a topic, research it, and write a book. What I'll do is pick a topic that's in an arena that I'm very interested in already for a long time. And then I'll write a book. And when I'm done, I'll do some research. I'll sort of almost keep a checklist of things I might want to investigate further, but I do it once the first draft is done, because I don't want the research to get in the way of me inventing and hearing that first draft in the way that with as much integrity to the imagination as possible. And
interesting. So what do you do then? Do you just essentially write that first draft, I'm stripping away all history, or just throwing in what you feel might exist?
Like, I was a fan of the 30s. And so, I knew a lot about the 30s before I wrote the book. I was a fan of Russian culture before I wrote A Gentleman in Moscow. So I'm drawing on that depth of knowledge to invent it. So it's not like there's a whole lot of empty blank spaces. Right. I can see something. Now, it may not be perfectly accurate. We can come back to this, but I'm okay with that. And there may be some placeholders, like you're saying, where I'll say, I don't really know how long it would take for a train to get from Chicago to New York. And I'm going to have to check on that later. But for the purposes of just writing, I'll say it was 24 hours. Right. And then I might revisit that. So there's some detail type things, but the bigger texture is something that I've chosen to tell a story at this time because I feel comfortable inventing in the time period. Now, what ended up happening though, in the case of A Gentleman in Moscow, I'd never spent a night in the hotel of Metropole when I wrote the book. When I finished the book, the first draft, I flew to Moscow and moved into the hotel. And similarly, here, when I finished the first draft of Lincoln Highway, it takes place over exactly 10 days in June of 1954. I thought, you know what? I should go and look at the front page of the New York Times for those 10 days, see what was happening.
Right.
And, you kind of lay them out. And there's a lot of things that you would sort of know. I mean, kind of vaguely, like McCarthy hearings are happening. There's a coup in Guatemala, and it becomes quickly clear that the CIA is probably involved. This is it's the 50s are happening, right? And it's happening on the front page in real time over the 10 days. But I get to like the third day, and the headline says something like National Civil Defense Test tomorrow, all activity to stop in 40 American cities as imaginary nuclear bombs dropped on the nation. I was like, what are you talking about? That is the craziest thing. And so then like, I race ahead to the next day to see what happened. And there is, this article saying, the defense occurred and, across the nation, 40 cities, all activities ceased for 10 days as people, retreated into bomb shelters, all commerce stopped, all motion stopped, all public spaces were cleared. And it was, as you say, it was a successful thing. And at the top of this article, on the front page of the New York Times, is a photograph of Times Square with a cop standing in it and everything else is gone. And I was like, this is the coolest, craziest thing I've ever heard. And so often this happens when I'm in this stage at the end of the book, when I'm doing this kind of research, I'll say, oh, I'm going to weave that baby back in. That belongs to the story, And then you have to say, well, now, am I going to go? Are they going to be there in Times Square when this happens? And that felt like too much to me. And so what ends up happening is a character is, having arrived in New York a few days later, is looking through old newspapers, just like I was doing. And he kind of races through the newspapers to see what happened. And what was part of the reason it was sort of like a gift, this whole crazy sort of discovery, is that Times Square was extremely important in the narrative already.
Right.
So, in fact, the Lincoln Highway, which is the first road to cross America from coast to coast, it was built in 1915,
right,
starts in Times Square of New York City. And that's kind of where I envisioned the whole vaudeville community kind of hanging out, the agents and the being in that arena and the bars. And so Times Square already played a big role. And here was this crazy event happening right there. So I folded it in. And then you get to this moment where I was like, do I include, is Wooly, the character who's thinking about it, is going to describe the picture in the paper? And you kind of toyed with that. And I was like, why wouldn't I put the picture in? Why wouldn't the reader get to see what I saw? And so yes, there's this photograph that appears in the middle of the book of this crazy event. And I love that when that happens too.
So I love hearing that after you've got the draft, basically, then you go back and brush in the history, the real history you find, which strikes me as, given what I do, it strikes me as a very efficient way to go about it, because you sort of pinpoint, but when did the Lincoln Highway per se enter the draft? From the very beginning?
No, in fact, if you looked at my first notebook from 2014, it's called Unfinished Business, because I didn't even know the Lincoln Highway existed at that time. And so I'd done a lot of development in the story. I'd gotten a lot of progress in designing many of the chapters. And I was kind of beginning to focus on even drafting chapters. There's a certain point, the third day, they have to leave the house and head to New York. And in my notes, it's sort of it was a placeholder, Route X. Really? And I was like, okay, it's kind of time to find out what the route is, because I want to think more vividly about which states they're going through and which cities they might go through. And
right.
And so I'm laying out the Midwestern, maps and looking at the close roads. And I notice in a map it says, in Route 30, Nebraska, in parentheses, formerly known as the Lincoln Highway. And I was like, oh, what's that? So this is a case where I took a step back and went back to sort of find out what that was. And I ended up in a rabbit hole, of great benefit. And I discovered, yes, what I was kind of talking to you about a second ago, that the Lincoln Highway was a highway designed by an American entrepreneur in 1915, built with private funds that he solicited from the public. And the background here is that what's kind of interesting is that in America, in 1910, 1920, 1915, the federal government wasn't involved in roads at all. And, the car was just coming of age, and in a big way at that time. And roads in America all grew out of city centers and townships outward from the depot and the post office and the bank into the suburbs, or, pre-suburbs, into the countryside where the farms were, or the light industry or whatever. That's what roads did. They kind of spidered out. And roads were not really designed to go from, say, Boston to Denver. For that kind of a distance, that's what the trains were for.
Right. Right.
It was very difficult to drive across the country once the car really became popular. There were millions of cars in America. You could not drive across the country. And so Carl Fisher, who was had made a fortune in car parts actually, and was a tireless entrepreneur and a patriot, felt that there should be a road that would allow citizens to drive from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean and see this great nation of ours. And the federal government wasn't interested, so he raised money by he barnstormed. He went from city to city giving speeches, and Teddy Roosevelt gave him money, and Thomas Edison gave him money, and Goodyear Tire Company gave money. The Boy Scouts raised money, and eventually he raised millions of dollars, and they built the road across the country. And the year that he came up with the idea, this will give you a sense of how hard it was to drive across America. 20 people drove across America per year in 1915.
Wow.
When he completed the road, 20,000 people began driving across the country annually. And so it was a huge success. And in 1920, it was the most famous road in America by far, as it was in the 30s and in the 40s. But when the interstate highway system was built in the 50s, those great 4-lane wide, massive routes built by the federal government to crisscross the nation, the Lincoln Highway became obsolete and kind of faded from view, but it is still there. So you can go to Times Square, and there's a sign where it shows where it begins, and you can drive all the way to San Francisco on the Lincoln Highway.
So was it then, once you discovered the Lincoln Highway, and this is now suddenly going to be a stream through your entire already finished rough draft?
Yeah.
Is that also then what accounts for the periodic references to Lincoln throughout?
Well, it was a gift because Lincoln already played a big role in the story.
Oh, okay, interesting. So
there was already, Willie was going to give the Gettysburg Address in this sort of emotional scene as a kid.
Interesting.
And so and as I say, anyways, so it was so Lincoln was already there. It was already East Coast, West Coast, New York, San Francisco was already there in the story. And then here was this crazy reality of American history that, that I had never heard of, that no one I've run into, most people I know have never heard of it. And it's a gift from heaven. And
serendipity.
So, the title of the book changed like that, and the route that they took changed too.
All right, so we're getting close to the time where we're going to have questions from the audience. So I have to ask you this. Now, you once told me about a gentleman in Moscow that the structure was very much in accord with a mathematical formula that you had devised. Okay,
that's right.
So, am I wrong, or are there, in fact, in this book, a lot of an underlayment of mathematical moments? I counted at least 16 moments, like the calculus of canceling out personal debts, or explaining why freight cars heading west were full, and otherwise there were some that were going to be empty. And also Zeno's paradox. I mean, there are little mathematical waypoints. Is that deliberate, or did that just happen?
That is fascinating, Eric. No one has observed that. I did not observe that.
I got 16 of them isolated, so
send them to me. I love and of course, this is what the creative process, what at its best is that some degree I should say this, part of the reason I'm such a big outliner is this is a little counterintuitive, is that it allows my subconscious to play a bigger role in the book. Because if I know what's going to happen when I sit down to write a chapter, I don't have to be thinking about what's going to happen or what the setting is. I know those things, or what the characters are like. I know those things. So what it means is that as I'm writing the chapter, my subconscious can take over, filling it with, notions from the characters or images that pop up, or little ideas that get sort of threaded out because of the events that are occurring. And a lot of the stuff you're describing come out of that process. Where I'm like, oh, I know it's going to be. Yeah, as you say, like, I know it's going to be about a morality tale, but suddenly I'm like, oh, no, it's going to be accounting. That's how he's going to do it. Almost as I'm writing, I'm sort of figuring that out. And then you sort of get the accounting thread sort of, rolls through the book, or the Zeno's paradox, that presents itself, because I know the character's having a hard time getting to where he's going.
Right.
So I was like, oh, it's like Zeno's paradox. And so it kind of finds its way. But at some subconscious level, I do believe that's, the serious narrative at its best has all these elements that are not necessarily under, it's not like a puppet master. I'm not choosing them with a specific intention, but I can tell by my instincts that they're in harmony with the rest of the work.
Right.
And that's what I need to know. Does this feel somehow like it's in harmony with the rest of the work? And then I'll explore it and build it, and hopefully it will then create resonances across the course of the narrative that I don't anticipate, but which provide different ways for readers to draw different kinds of conclusions as they make associations.
Well, so along those lines, I mean, you could, reading this, so let's say you're in a lit crit class 10 years down the road studying Amor Towles, at Yale or something like that, and various allusions to Ulysses, various classical allusions and so forth. Is that something that became a deliberate, these classical touchstones because of the Ulysses story, being blown off course just as it's approaching Ithaca, that whole saga?
I'm not doing it so that students will have something to study in the future, but I am doing something it's a close reason, which is that I think that the novel at its best is a machine for meaning, where it's got these thousands of components, images and comments and ideas that are expressed, and settings and personalities and plot events and all that stuff, and the poetry of the language, and which is, but literally thousands and thousands of elements that come together to build a novel that are in there drifting around in some sort of chaotic harmony. That's why when a novel is done well, different people can read it, be equally entertained by it, but walk away with very different impressions of what it means. Is because they're assembling some sort of combination of those various elements, whether consciously or unconsciously, and saying, this book is really about, and then they'll tell you, and that's one also reasons why in a fine work of literature, we can read it at the age of 20, 40, 60, and 80, and be entertained each time, but have a very different impression of what that book means.
Right.
So I am conscious about that. I want my books to be rich and layered and have various elements that may trigger associations. But as I say, less for the student and more for the reader to suddenly create some kind of association that will trigger a thought.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
But the classical allusions aside, what I was struck by is that Lincoln High was very Steinbeckian, if you will. Very much Steinbeckian. I mean, you've got the classical central element.
Good adjective. It's a good adjective.
Good. I copyrighted it, but you can use it. But it has that, that central journey, not the journey they plan to take, but it has that what you can perceive as a central journey with all the various stories being told along the path. And I'm curious, what kind of mood were you striving to capture or create in the book? And when I say that, I mean, what was like going through your mind in terms of, I don't know, do you ever think in terms of the music that would accompany the reading of this book, or did you think in terms of paintings that you've seen that capture the mood of the book?
I think that there's the time period, right? So there's an element to which I want it to sound like the 50s in some way. But the geographic component is key. So I do want those opening chapters. I want the reader to feel the openness of the Midwest, the sparseness of it, the simplicity, the pragmatic simplicity of farm life, which is simplicity. I don't mean that in a condescending sense. I just mean that, your mission is very straightforward, as a farmer, when you have to work this land, you're going to plant these things, you're going to hope that it works out, and you're going to, there's a very clean, pragmatic aspect to that, which is also is very hard, right? Whereas the New York City world is totally different. And so as the story moves from the Midwest towards New York City, I am conscious that I want the tone and the tenor, in essence, to be shifting from this sparse Midwestern pragmatic environment that Emmett personifies, but you're moving towards this sort of intricacy where it's getting louder and cluttered and more confusing almost and faster as you get towards your destination on the East Coast. So I kind of think about those things about from a tonal standpoint.
Right. So let's get back to process. Tell us about Amor Towles and his workday. Tell us where you are right now.
Yeah.
Is this where you write in your office, library, whatever?
I'm in the library in our residence, and which is where I do most of my work in Manhattan. And I'm a get up early, have a cappuccino, a bagel, do the crossword, but then I'm at my desk at 8 or 8:30, and I work at my desk till noon, and then I carry work with me to go have lunch by myself. Occasionally, I have lunch with you, but more frequently, I have lunch by myself, and where I will sit at the bar of a restaurant, and I either edit the morning's writing, print it out, carry it, and start to edit it and rethink it, or I'll bring the notebook, let's say, and I will start thinking about tomorrow's chapter, and I'll be writing by hand, trying to figure my way into the chapter. Where is this going to begin, the scene, and what is the tone of it? What is going to be on the mind of Emmett as the day begins, let's say, and so I'll do that. And so it's kind of that 8 to 1 is the lion's share of doing the work. And
so what do you do after lunch then?
Personal business, reading, essays, TV, exercise, cooking, life, Eric.
Yeah.
I don't have a job usually until 5:30 or something. Usually.
Yeah, and I should ask John. John, do you have a question for us, or?
We've got quite a few viewer questions. If
okay, let's go for it.
Ready for it.
Go. Sorry, we were prattling on.
No, I mean, I'm going to say as well, Eric, that you have this uncanny ability of prescience to anticipate so many of our viewers' questions. So I was sort of it was fascinating that you seemed like you were tapping into their minds. This is I've never seen this happen before, so it's really cool to see an interlocutor ask questions that are also very much top of mind of the viewers. So that was pretty compelling as well. And so apologies, I've tried to sort of sort these to make sure that I'm getting to the ones that haven't already been answered. And apologies if I retread some of that territory, and please let me know if I am. But there is a question for interactivity right off the bat. People want to know if both of you can share a book from behind them, commenting on your beautiful bookshelf. So I don't know if there's maybe a emblematic book to this conversation that is currently behind both of you that you can pluck off the shelves. There we go.
The joy of cooking. The joy of cooking.
So there you go. You see, you were right there about that.
There we are. Yeah, absolutely. Good.
That's a first edition of the Grapes of Wrath. So clearly
that's a first edition.
Yeah. It's clearly a book that matters to me.
Terrific.
There's a question about food here as well. Mary writes, we note that bouillabaisse and fettuccine mio amore play large roles in your two most recent wonderful books. Are you a foodie, and what is your recipe for fettuccine mio amore?
The recipe for fettuccine mio amore is at amortowles.com. If you go to I think it's in the Q&A, or if you go to the Q&A and scroll through it, you will see it there. But as is, the recipe for the Latvian stew. If you Google Amor Towles Gentleman Moscow Latvian stew, you can find that recipe, which is from Gentleman Moscow, which is a great dish as well. I like putting food in my books. It seems very natural to me. I think of our lives. Food is in our lives at all times, right? It's at the center of our holidays and the way we gather as families. It's as an immediate family, we sit down at night with our children, and that's kind of where the family business and guidance takes place. It's how we go out with friends. So I feel like food is around us at all times in this very festive and incredibly important human way. So it's very natural for me to kind of wind it into my narratives, and I don't mind describing the dishes themselves, because I feel like it's a little bit of a sleight of hand. I feel if I can describe a dish or a cocktail well, that it brings the reader into the moment, and so that it feels somehow more. They feel like they're there, and that allows to sort of me to amp up the impact of the conversation that's happening, or of the interaction of the characters, by making sort of the readers sort of feel like I'm there as this meal is taking place. And so,
and in your Gentleman in Moscow, you achieved that incredibly in those wonderful meals. That last famous meal that was concocted by all his friends in the hotel, and his lovely scene.
Thank you.
There's a question here about, I know we talked a little bit about research, but Cindy writes, interested in your research process, all the mythology, the Greek heroes, etc. I'm curious, maybe we can expand this to a question about for both of you about research processes, and for Amor, researching history to sort of incorporate it into fictional work, and for you, Erik, kind of a different process. So maybe how those are related and interrelated.
Erik, I know I've asked you this before, but I never tire of hearing you talk about it. But because related to this question of John's is when we first met, one of the things that really, and we were talking about how we approach our different work and sort of going back and forth over a meal, of course. One of the things that struck me right off the bat is that you were like, well, I think we were talking about In the Garden of the Beast, and you were struggling for your entry point, kind of, I don't know, struggle maybe too strong a word, but you're trying to figure out, is this going to be my topic, and where is this for me or not, and does it have what I want in terms of a narrative I'm going to write? And you said, then I found my character, and I just remember being like, oh, that's fascinating, because I as someone who's a fiction writer all my life, character is something that I kind of imagined as an imagined person. It would never thought of someone who's writing nonfiction, grounded in very serious research, that you would think of the historical figures as characters. Can you describe what you mean by that? Because I think it's fascinating.
Well, it's just a semantic thing. I mean, it's a way of describing the people that I write about in a nonfiction way. I think of them as characters. I mean, honestly, I think of them as characters very much, I'm sure, as you think about characters, only my characters have to be real live people, and everything about them has to be factual and so forth. And frankly, that makes the process a whole lot easier for me than it is for you. My people are there, and I just have to pick out the details.
But now when you look at 8 people, let's say you've been doing your research on a particular topic or arena, like the embassy in Berlin in the 30s, it's at the center of the embassy. Is not all of the people that you're studying will sort of rise up from the research and present themselves to you in this kind of form as a real character. So what is it that you're looking for that in among this sort of an assembly of historical figures, what is the person who kind of suddenly leaps off the page to you and you're like, okay, there's something here I can really talk about or tell?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of it's case by case, but sometimes it's simply a matter of I come across a character who just has such an interesting story to tell, possibly even a story that sort of stretches the imagination, even though it's absolutely a true story, that I just say to myself, I don't care what happens, this character is going in the book. And that's that character's role. Maybe he or she will appear for, a three paragraph anecdote, maybe for a good chunk of a chapter, but that person will be a big deal. But when I talk about looking for a character, the Garden of Beasts was sort of classic. I mean, I wanted to capture a sense of what it was like, what would have been like if I had been in Berlin in 1933-34 during Hitler's rise. What would I have seen, felt, and so forth? What would anybody have felt in that time? So I started deliberately looking for characters to tell that story. But it was only when I came across the ambassador's daughter, Martha Dodd, that I realized, wow, okay, now I have a way to tell this story, because she was just so wonderful, a great counterpoint to him. And so that's how that
and she's amazing. She did amazing things, which are terrific, but she's also a great personality. And so it's a pleasure to get to know her and to see what was going on in the embassy through her involvement.
So it was interesting when you were talking earlier about your process of historical research. In so many ways, we approach it exactly the opposite. I need to have critical mass, most of my research done before I can start to write. You write, and then you go back and layer in the bits of research. And one thing on that subject, I'm very curious about the Howard Johnson's placemat.
Yeah, right.
Now, where did that come from? I mean, well, as a kid, we actually traveled a lot from New York to the Midwest, because I had relatives there by car, and would stop at Howard Johnson's all the time. And I remember those placemats vividly.
Yeah, I have no idea where what I can tell you is this: Howard Johnson's presented presented itself to me as I was telling the story, probably because my grandparents were old Bostonians, and my grandparents were sort of Boston Brahmin types. They began to winter in Florida in like the 60s. And my grandfather and grandmother would get in a station wagon in Boston and they would drive to Florida over a period of days. And that's every season they'd drive back and forth, beginning of the season, end of season, that kind of thing. And one of my grandfather's favorite possessions was a map of America that had every Howard Johnson's on the map because he loved ice cream. And he liked to take different routes, and he didn't know where they were going to spend the night sometimes, or how much progress they're going to make, or when he would want the ice cream. But so he basically, he's like, to my grandmother, Eleanor, get the map out of the glove compartment, as they're driving, whatever, through Georgia, and they'd be like looking for, okay, there's one, if you go, 16 miles to the east, we can go to, and he would go get ice cream at the Howard Johnson. So I kind of always remember that. And so I think as the kids were, heading east, I was like, they got to go to Howard Johnson's, of course, just like my grandfather would. Yeah. And then I had this sort of notion of the placemat with the map on it, and the map within the map on the placemat,
right,
and how this would appeal to Wooly, and play sort of a critical role as Wooly disappears with the map, but that's the map is how his Duchess is going to find him again, but not through the big route, Phillips 66 map or whatever it's called, Phillips, but through this sort of little map that you're having your pancakes on.
Yeah. That was inspired.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we've got time for just a couple more questions. And thank you to all of you who submitted questions. There's a lot of great ones here, and I'm sorry I can't get to all of them. I'm going to focus on just a couple more craft questions to finish it up that can involve both of you. Caitlin writes, we're in the middle of NaNoWriMo this month, and you mentioned it takes you a year to complete your first draft. Do you think condensed writing timelines challenges are limiting, or can they be effective?
That's a very personal thing. I think that and I think this is true in nonfiction as well as fiction. Erik probably knows peers who, we look at Caro, I don't know how long did it take Caro to write, the Power Broker, 20 years or something like that. And there's, David McCullough has written books, sometimes he's written, 3 books in 8 years or 7 years kind of thing. And they're all, fine works. And novels are the same thing. There's people working at very different time frames to accomplish different things, and in a process that works for them. And so I think that's fine. I also think that it's sort of, in the creative arts, generally having something that can prompt you to do work is productive, right? A few rules that you're going to follow by the decision. I'm going to write a sonnet. A sonnet is just a bunch of rules, and if you got spare time, you try to write a sonnet, and you have to solve the puzzle of the rules of the sonnet, the 14 lines, and the iambic pentameter, as the rhyming and the rhyming scheme being A, B, A, B, and C, D, C, D. Those are little rules that prompt you to be creative, to fill out the shape of the rules. And that can be very terrific as a starting point. Erik has mentioned, I use structural mathematics in my work often to kind of design things and give me some shape, like the 10 days, and thinking about it as a countdown. That's a way of sort of triggering some kind of work. I don't know. What do you think, Erik, about that?
It's so alien to how I operate and what I do that I can't even. I spent like 3 or 4 years doing research and a year and a half or whatever writing, and there are certain fixed points that I actually can't compress.
Yeah, right.
And there's a question here from Lisa. Your books, Amor, lead the reader through the story in a very assured way. I was shocked you were a first-time novelist in Rules. And you have alluded to this emphasis on craftsmanship in this discussion. Is this something you've learned through instruction or instinct? Both. So I guess to open up that question up further, both of you is where does this craftsmanship, come from?
Yeah, no, I'd be interested in hearing Erik talk about that too. For me, I wanted to be a writer starting in first grade when I learned how to read. Basically, those things began at the same time. And as soon as I could read, I was interested in writing, and all my life has been read, write, repeat. and I'd discover the short stories of Ray Bradbury, and I'd write a science fiction story, and then I'd read Agatha Christie, and I'd write a mystery story, and I'd read Dickens, and I'd sort of the way I would write paragraphs would shift under Dickens, or my tone of my narrator would shift, and so it was this constant process of reading very carefully and closely, trying to understand what an author was doing, how they were doing it, why they were doing it, how the language was functioning, why an image kept showing up, and the impact that had on me as I read, the tone of it, everything, the semantics of it. I just constantly reading as a writer, and very carefully and thoughtfully about the books that I cared about. But then, as I say, you shove that aside and you go and do your work, and you try to hone your craft by getting better at doing setting, or getting better at doing dialogue, getting better at doing the articulation of an idea, and trying to master, as I said earlier, the sort of the chaotic harmony. To me, is the biggest achievement that you can go for, is where you have enough command of the elements of craft and a strong enough sense of the story that you can rely on your instincts to start. That when suddenly it says, oh, you know what, he's not going to go that way, he's going to go this way, and he's going to fall down the stairs, and the vase is going to break, and his mom's going to walk through the door at just that moment, you're like, yes. And I can feel that whole crazy little moment is going to be perfect at this time, and is in harmony with the rest of the book thematically for some weird reason, but as I say, you have to have all the elements of craft in place for me to free myself up to go with my instincts of an event, because I don't have to be hesitant about how to describe the character, how to describe the room, how to describe the mother when she enters, how to describe the sound of a vase breaking. All those things have to have been sort of mastered to some degree. So that's in the past, so that when I'm writing the scene, my imagination can take over. But yeah, so it's kind of for me, I appreciate your saying that there was a sense of assurance in Rules of Civility. That is not a coincidence. That is the back end of 30 years of work. Erik, for you, because you were a journalist, right? I mean, before you wrote your first work of narrative nonfiction.
Yep.
But what was the route for you in terms of mastering the very clear command of narrative nonfiction? You're one of the best narrative nonfiction writers in the country. But how did you make the transition, say, from journalism to this other form?
Well, my route was your route, Amor. I mean, as a kid writing, Nancy Drew was my go-to storyteller, story queen, and I wrote a novel when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 or 12. It was very derivative of Nancy Drew book. It was 75 pages. It had a sex scene, and I didn't know anything about sex, so it was really bizarre. I'd love to find that story again. But I just love to read and to write and to read and to write and to draw. For a long time, I thought I was going to be a New Yorker cartoonist until the New Yorker very, very early on assured me that I was not. No, it's just a process of learning, reading. But I also found it very important to adopt a writer as whose work, whose prose style I really felt was very powerful and very clarifying. And for me, that I adopted a number of these. Raymond Chandler, I know Hemingway is sort of not necessarily in the vogue at the moment, and probably not for the last 50 years, but to me, he's sort of a lighthouse in terms of the art of not saying, about channeling prose and minimizing and parsing and paring prose down to the absolute necessary phrases. And to me, so I've read everything by Hemingway, everything by Chandler, everything by Tolstoy, as a matter of fact, in English, alas, just because I want to absorb what they know. And I think over time, I mean, I'm not a craftsman like Amor, but over time, you learn how to put words together, and you learn what makes sense and where you can reach out and bring in something that seems far afield but isn't. And I don't know what it is, but it's just a process, a thing that happens. Yep.
Thank you both. Someone does want to know, Beth asks, how did you both meet? I love both of your writing styles, as diverse as they are, and have found your relationship very enjoyable in this discussion.
Didn't we arrange lunch via Twitter?
Yeah, it was something like that. I mean, for those who don't know, Erik lived for a long time in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, he and his family, and he came to New York And I think that we discovered that you had read A Gentleman in Moscow, maybe, and and I had read your work, and you were in New York City, I was in New York City, and we had lunch.
Yeah, no, that was it. I mean, it was a completely random thing. I had tweeted something without knowing Amor. I just tweeted my absolute adoration of A Gentleman in Moscow, and then he thanked me essentially for that, and we communicated and had lunch.
It's probably the only good thing that's ever happened to me on Twitter.
I know it's one of the few profound benefits of Twitter.
Well, I was going to say the power of the internet to bring you both together. And of course, again, tonight, of course, those bookstores are purveyors of analog technology, but events like this wouldn't really be possible without Zoom. So one of the silver linings, I suppose, of this sort of prolonged pandemic stage. But Erik Larson and Amor Towles, thank you both so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for listening tonight. And Erik, thank you for sitting in with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for letting me ask you questions.
Thank you, folks. And of course, there were some questions too about your books. If you need assistance tracking down the book that was associated with your ticket this evening, please reach out to the bookstore you purchased your ticket from. They'll be sure to help you out. And please continue to support your local bookstores through this holiday season. Our friends at Prairie Lights, King's English Bookshop, and Tattered Cover, and of course, us here at Literati in Ann Arbor. Appreciate it and can't thank you enough for your support these past 20 months. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next event. So take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Everybody stay well.